Hi, everyone. I'm Heather Box. I am the co-founder of the Million Person Project. And the Million Person Project is a global project about love, storytelling, and connecting changemakers. And I'm so excited to be here today with Lori Adelman. She co-runs Feministing, and she's a reproductive health advocate. So welcome, and thank you so much for joining the conversation about the power of personal storytelling.
Thank you, Heather. Hi, thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, I would love for you to just introduce yourself to the viewers.
Sure. Well, you got us off to a fantastic start. I'm Lori, and I co-run Feministing with two other amazing folks, Maya and Joss, and I've been doing that work in some capacity for about 6 years now. Feministing is actually 12 years old, so I joined about halfway through, and we are a community that's run by and for young feminists, and we've evolved a lot over time. But I think we have a through line of really just wanting to toe the line for what progressive thought leadership around issues of gender, race, and identity can really look like. So it's been really fun to be part of that journey with the entire Feministing crew. And as you also mentioned, I have other interests that are interrelated with that website, have been a long time communications and advocacy professional in the reproductive health and justice community, worked for several nonprofits, and currently working for Planned Parenthood in the global division around that.
Feministing is a culture-shifting publication that is doing that through people using their voice, telling their stories, making themselves heard. I'm curious about, when was the first time that you really used your own voice and stood up?
Absolutely. So I actually was introduced to Feministing as a fan, as a reader, when I was in college. So I always knew that the community was something special because I had witnessed that firsthand. And I had felt the strength of hearing someone else's story that I could relate to. And I knew the power of that. And so even when I first joined up with the site and started blogging with them, I knew that I was interested in, writing for them and having my own voice represented on that platform, but I also was really interested in the platform itself and what that could mean on a large scale if we had this really strong community of young women who weren't scared to tell their own stories and had a real source of resources in order to do that. And so we have had a variety of stories shared. We've had revelations shared. People talk about everything from their experience, seeing a sexist product in a store and calling the store manager and having it removed. That was one of the first actions that our website saw, where there was a pair of underwear in a junior department that said right on the crotch, "Who needs a credit card?" And they wrote about it, and it caused a big uproar. Yeah, I mean, who comes up with these things anyway? I really don't know. But the product was pulled, and so that was sort of a little dipping of your toe into the activism pool and seeing, hey, this is pretty exciting. This feels great. We've also had people share really personal stories about their sexual assault, recovering from trauma, microaggressions in the workplace, and sharing experiences of having their hair touched or having insensitive comments made about police brutality, for example, in the workplace, and being able to share that side of things and have people relate to that. But for me personally, I would say that probably a story that really hit home for me was around the news story known as, quote unquote, the rape cop in New York. I don't know if you remember this, but it was a really difficult, terrible story. What happened was, in New York, which is where I live, and I've lived here for about 8 years now, so it definitely feels like home. A woman was drunk. She was coming home from a party, and she was way too intoxicated to get home. And what ended up happening is she was kind of struggling to get into the cab and called the police to help escort her home in an act of asking for help and seeking safety. And the cop ended up taking her upstairs to her home and sexually assaulting her and raping her. And the violation there was just felt so devastating and felt like such a betrayal of trust in the community. And obviously so many communities have been raising their voice recently and for so many years about the loss of trust in policing in this country. But this had a distinctly genderized lens, and it felt really personal and hit close to home. And so not only did I share my story on our website about being so enraged by this, but we also were able to move the actions pretty effortlessly from the internet to the streets. And that was something that was really gratifying, and I think helped the community start to heal around this, because we brought out people in masses in front of the courthouse when this trial was being prosecuted. And I think the connection between the blogging and sharing of how upsetting this was to our community really helped fuel some of the protests that happened. And that was a really gratifying moment for me.
When you were writing the piece, was it about a call to action, or what was it like for you to write the piece? When you decided that you were going to publish it, were you negotiating what possible backlash might be? What was your feeling about it?
Yeah, and that was something that that's one reason I wanted to use this example as well, because there were several pieces and they didn't start out, as this call to action, let's hit the streets. It started out, oh, we should cover this case on the blog. This sounds really disturbing. And then when you dig in and you find out the details, and these ring true for you. It could have been me. It could have been my neighbor. I've been to that bar. I know that party. I've been that person who called that cab, and I know people who have as well. And this could have been any of us. These stories really resonate with me, where I sort of, for lack of a better phrase, wrote myself into a frenzy with this and really felt motivated to get involved. And again, I don't want to gloss over the impact that so many other organizers had in bringing folks together around this issue, and had way before I stumbled upon this one case. But I think the idea that you go from covering a case with some detachment or to share information to really understanding all of the systemic issues that made that case possible, and then wanting to change the reality of that, I think was a process that was pretty unique to me and my website in that time period, and that felt really empowering.
In other stories that you've told, in other pieces of writing that you've done, how have you negotiated people being critical on the internet? I think for our viewers, that's a lot of what people are negotiating when they're thinking about sharing their personal story, when they're thinking about revealing parts of themselves that they've never revealed publicly before. They're negotiating, what would it be like to share this publicly, and what would the reactions be?
Absolutely. I mean, that is the question, right? That's not just a question for a blogger. In today's world, everyone is making decisions pretty much all the time about how much to share, when to share, what platform to share it on. That's a negotiation that is constant. And actually, you're catching me at a very vulnerable time on this topic, because I just finished watching Beyonce's Lemonade. And I know it just came out yesterday. So, folks may not have gotten a chance to watch the whole thing, but I won't spoil it, but to say she shares a lot of her life in that, and in a way that I think is very relatable. And it is very scary. When I first graduated from college and, shared with my friends and family that I wanted to get into the very lucrative business of feminist blogging, a lot of folks were not thrilled about that. And I actually felt a lot of pressure to hold different pieces of information about myself so that I wouldn't, quote unquote, ruin my chances of getting a real job later in life. And I think, there was this sense that and this was, again, I don't want to date myself, but, almost 10 years ago at this point, if you came out and you wrote on the internet about abortion, or you wrote on the internet about feminism, or you wrote on the internet about your gender identity or your racial identity, that was it. You were not respectable for a wide swath of the working world for the rest of your life, and that your name would be associated to these really controversial things. So that was one element of it that you have to fight against. And then, of course, the other element is just putting yourself out there in terms of sharing something that might be painful or sensitive or make you feel vulnerable, and not being able to guarantee that the comment section won't tear you apart, or that it won't, be taken out of context, or all of these different things. So I think there are so many forces especially in today's world, that push up against this idea of sharing an honest truth, really. And one thing that, I love how the internet is evolving and how it's professionalizing and how it's building out so many amazing tools and platforms for folks to use. But I think one thing that you lose is that little feeling of anonymity that you used to be able to find in small corners of the internet, where you could have forums for people to just talk about their sexual assaults with each other, or places where you could blog under an anonymous handle and folks wouldn't try to dox you and hunt you down and find out your real identity. Something that's ironic about the fact that we're simultaneously more easily able to share right now through all of these different mediums, and then the stakes are a little bit higher in terms of sharing your truth.
Mm. I'm sure you give people advice all the time when they're thinking about publishing on your blog. What is your specific advice to someone who is negotiating that decision?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, it's also something that's really individual. Like, there's no blanket advice, because you know what you're best able to, to take, and what you're ready to share and what you're not ready to share. I encourage folks to never read the comments. That's just like, let's get that out of the way, but never do that. Really think about your personal goals in sharing this information and hone in on that. A lot of my work is not about getting folks to publish things on feministing necessarily, but I just do a lot of general media work with folks who have an advocacy goal or feel like their voice isn't represented in mainstream media. I do a lot of editing and helping with folks with just pitching in general. And the first thing that you always say is, before you even write this piece, who are you trying to reach with it? What are you trying to do with it? I think a lot of folks write something that feels very true to them and then want to say, here, world, take this and run with it. And I think, I understand that impulse, of course, but I find that folks tend to feel more successful at the end of the process if they had a clear goal before any of that even happened. And that way they can target their story. They can choose which parts of their story to expose to this, honestly, sometimes really brutal process of publishing. The clearer you can get on that, the better. And that's one thing that I really see with a lot of younger people as well, where they're like, but this is true and it feels true to me and it should be out there. And I think in a lot of ways that's really admirable and that's really right. But in some other ways, that's not the whole picture.
Hmm. Yeah. So it's like finding the connection between how your truth frees you,
right,
and how it connects with your audience.
I mean, I love that. Yes, absolutely.
And in your global work and in the work you do around the US too, what is the importance of people telling their own stories?
The importance is high. As the digital divide becomes less, I see so many more different communities, and especially historically marginalized communities around the world, getting to reclaim their own narratives. And it is so fun. It is so overdue. I love it so much. One example I have from a few years ago in my global work, I was working at a different NGO that I work at now that did global sexual reproductive health and rights, and had a lot of partnerships in Africa, Asia, and Latin America around that, and had recently done a communications training with a sex worker collective in India. And it was a few days, a pretty short training, nothing too intense, but they had talked about, video, framing, how to post stuff online, all of these things. And a few months later, Vice went in and did a documentary about this same sex worker collective, and they framed it in a sensationalized way. The framing that they chose was prostitutes of God, which is not how the sex worker collective viewed themselves or framed their own stories. And I think if this had happened 4 years before, that would have been kind of the end of the story. Oh, this documentary crew got it wrong, and maybe not a lot of folks would have known about that. But the way the chips fell was that the sex worker collective posted their own response video about that documentary and how they felt that it had gotten things wrong, and actually how they felt that there were numerous ways in which it had violated the rights of the folks that it had been looking to cover, including outing an HIV positive minor. And to this day, when you Google the name of that documentary, the response video is the first result to come up in Google. And I love that story because I think it really gets at the ways in which global communities are reclaiming their own narratives. And when you think about global health and foreign policy and all of these resources moving from the Western world, or, you know, the global North to the global South, there have been all of these historical connotations to that. And colonialism is still a force that is just, you know, so strong and has left its mark in so many different ways. And there's such a lack of trust, I think, across borders and among different communities. And the field of global health needs to continue to change and evolve to account for that lack of trust that exists and to make amends and to really show that it's committed to true partnership in terms of sharing resources and sharing funding and putting narratives out there that really involve true consent of the communities that they're talking about.
Yeah, I love that story about Vice, and I love that idea of being able to respond instantly
Absolutely.
to this narrative and not having to say like, oh, let me try to get this op-ed published
Right.
somewhere. But no, like, let me take the video on me and respond to it. That's really awesome. What has it been like for you to negotiate telling your own personal story? And have you, and why not, or what parts, and what is it like to be this voice of feminism, and what do you see that your personal story in relationship to that is?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's a big question. And I would say I've shared some and not all, you know, at the big picture, that's probably where I'm at on this. And I think there is no one true voice of feminism, right? That's not a thing. That doesn't exist. Many have tried to claim that that's a thing. Many have tried to claim themselves as, you know, anoint themselves. But that's a title that just isn't real. So I think a lot of my work has led me to the conclusion that I'm actually really into nerding out on building strong platforms, and that a lot of what attracted me to like blogging and writing isn't actually about sharing like my personal story in the sense of I grew up here and I had this hardship and this is how I overcame it. Although sometimes I think sharing personal details like that about myself is important and relevant, and I have done that in different ways. But I just really am excited by the idea of creating spaces where these stories can be shared. And I won't say that those spaces are completely safe, but what we say at Feministing is that those spaces are accountable, and that we're accountable to each other, to creating and keeping that space, and to honoring the person who's entering that space. And so I think for me, you know, I'm happy to share details about myself. Folks know that I've talked a lot about, you know, growing up with a single mom and kind of growing up in a matriarchal vacuum where I really had this very strong image of womanhood and feminism, even though she probably wouldn't have called it that. And so that's, of course, inspired me so much. But I also have, you know, felt more and more that because there is such an urge within the media to anoint the one true feminist, we have to work even harder to push back against that. And a lot of my work co-running Feministing has been to just really support young women. Like, it has been really behind the scenes a lot of the time. Like, people are usually surprised when, you know, I say I run Feministing, because I don't publish a ton there anymore. I published a lot more when I wasn't running the site. And now a lot of it is about, you know, little minutia, like, you know, paying bills and stuff like that. And I'm like, how did I end up like spending my Saturday filling invoices? And then I'm like, oh yeah, because I really care about this community. And also just supporting people, because, you know, we have members of the crew who come from all different kinds of backgrounds, and it's not always second nature to create space and time to really write down their thoughts, and their thoughts are powerful and their voices are powerful. And so there's all different ways to support those people. And that's what we're really trying to hone in on and tap into.
And who has been one of your biggest influences in your life?
So I know you're also going to be interviewing Samita. Definitely want to say her and a lot of the former leadership team members of Feministing have been really wonderful and great in all of their different ways and diverse ways. And I'm looking forward to hearing your talk with Samita, because she's a really smart, interesting person. I've had bosses who took me under their wing in the nonprofit world when I probably had just zero understanding of what to do in an office setting. Like, I'm sure I have the drive, like I'm smart, like put me to work, but I don't understand office politics and emailing and how to wow the boss. I didn't grow up with that background. So that was all kind of like on the job learning. And I was very lucky to have patient bosses who didn't give up on me because I said the wrong thing at the wrong time. And that's, I think, a really important thing, especially for young women of color who maybe don't come from a background where their family is really well versed in these kind of like office dynamics. It's a learned skill. And then there's personalities and writers and voices out there who are just like North Star guidance. I don't want to name one over the other, but there's so many. Melissa Harris Perry is someone who I look up to a lot, and she's been in the news lately. I can't wait to see where she's going to go now that she has opportunities to take on new projects after her show has ended. And Ta-Nehisi Coates, a brilliant, just beautiful writer. People like some former columnists of feministing, Zerlina Maxwell, who sort of treads this line beautifully between digital media and electoral politics. She went from being kind of like a political personality to now working directly on the Hillary campaign. And I think that's really an amazing transition to make. I'm really impressed by that. Michael Denzel Smith is writing a book right now. I think his voice is so important to our generation. So there's so many people who I'm lucky to call friends and who inspire me.
When you were coming into your own voice, who was an influence, one person that influenced that, and how did they influence you being able to step out with your own voice?
A lot of people that I've never met. Like, I think bravery is contagious. And when I read something that maybe is like objectively outside of the norm, right, and I identify with it, that is so powerful. And, at Feministing, we get letters from like really young tweens, teens, writing from their high school or their middle school. And they'll be like, yeah, these boys are just like arguing with me, everything I say in social studies class or something. And I don't understand why. And then I read your website and I felt like less shitty about that. And that is an amazing feeling. And I think those are like the little moments that have built up in my life where we have such an amazing geography of digital writing now, where there's so many more experiences that you can tap into and so many people's personal stories that you can tap into, even on platforms like podcasting, Hebben and Tracy's podcasts on BuzzFeed, and personal essays that folks are writing. Durga Chubas writes amazing essays. Hannah Georges, also at BuzzFeed, thinking about people who just unflinchingly share really scary truths. And I'm like, okay, if they can do that, I can do that too.
Given everything that's happening in the world right now with politics and feminism and race, what do you believe is the role of stories in this really kind of contentious dialogue that's happening? And whose stories aren't being told? Who are we not hearing from?
Mm-hmm. So stories humanize. So in a contentious election cycle, for example, research shows that really the only thing that changes people's minds about their political positions are stories. Because they have the potential to be so powerful, it is so devastating that we aren't hearing everyone's stories right now. And digitizing media has enabled more of those stories to be told, but there are still so many that aren't there. There are people who think that the internet is more of a democracy than it is, and actually all of the systems of oppression that exist in the quote unquote real world are right there waiting for you when you go online. That separation is false. And so you have, all of the historically marginalized folks, especially people of color, young people, low-income people, gender nonconforming, trans people, all of these different communities, their stories are just not being told. And sometimes when they do end up getting told, we get a false sense of, well, I've heard from one person, so I've heard from all of them, and I think it's really important to know that we're not even close to having enough of their stories. And I can't wait for the saturation to happen there, but we're very far off.
Well, thank you so much for joining this conversation. I would love for you to share with our viewers what your vision for the world is. Given everything that's going on in the world right now, Where do you believe we're moving towards, and what is your vision for us there?
I really am heartened. I'm actually very optimistic about where things are going and each generation leaving things a little bit better off than the past one. You know, I was at a friend's Passover Seder last night, and one of the questions the Torah asks is whether time is circular or progressive. And we had a little mini debate, and I think there was a bit of a generational divide that younger people felt generally more optimistic about where things are going. And I definitely identify with that. I think there have been amazing moments of activism and advocacy that are pushing us forward. And there's data that shows that younger people identify more as global citizens. They care more about what's going on in the world. They are more fluid with their identity, and they're more supportive of other people's identities being different than their own. So all of that is very heartening to me. And my vision for the world is one where those young people, which I'm going to not count myself in the young person category, but those young people just grow up in a place where they truly have the freedom, the freedom for creative expression, political expression, all of these things to manifest the world that they actually want, because I think it's all going to be on them.
Well, thank you so much for joining the conversation and for sharing parts of yourself and your work with the viewers. And I would love for you to leave the viewers with a way that they can get involved and follow what you're up to.
Absolutely. Thank you. This was so fun, Heather. Thank you so much for having me. And if folks want to learn more about any of the things I've been talking about, the best way is to subscribe to the Feministing newsletter, where we share updates from the blog and also other parts of our lives. And I will be sharing this interview there with folks as well.
Cool. Well, thank you so much, Lori, and thank you for your work. And thank you, viewers, for tuning in, and we'll see you tomorrow.
Great. Bye.